Hey guys, again, we're going to take ourselves down the next pathway, which is factoring to solve quadratic equations. Remember, we learned two methods already for solving quadratic equations. The first was to use the roots off of the graph. Remember, we found something like, I'll pick one of my nice graphs here. So if we used a graph like this, and then we were able to look at the zeros on the graph, and then find that those were the answers for our roots or our zeros of the equation. And then we also had another where we found that we could isolate an equation to have only an x squared, and it was in one of those formats of x squared equals k. And we found out that we could solve those by going through and just square rooting both sides of the equation. In this next one, it's a little bit more complicated. We're going to need to go ahead and move forward, use some skills that you have from a previous unit to factor quadratic equations and solve them. The standard that we're working on today is to write and solve equations in one variable and use them to solve problems using quadratic functions. Again, we're continuing to work with those quadratic functions. Now you'll notice again as you're going through your notes, I have no note page icon up here in the corner, which means that this isn't something that must be written in your notebook. Next, I want to review probably what's one of my personal favorite properties in math, and it's called the zero product property. Again, if you notice up here, there's no notebook icon. If this makes sense and you remember it, that's great. If not, you might want to take a minute and write it down. Our property states that for any real numbers, a and b, if a times b equals 0, then a or b needs to be equal to 0. And what this essentially means is that we cannot get an answer of 0 by multiplying unless one of those two numbers that we multiply is 0. So for example, if we take a number times 12 and get 0 as an answer, we know that that other number has to be 0. You cannot get 0 as an answer in multiplication unless you have 0 in your problem. So we use that to our advantage when we're solving quadratic equations, and you can see that here if I have two quantities that are multiplied by each other, so I have x plus 3 times the quantity x plus 2, and that's equal to 0, I know then that either x plus 3 has to equal 0 or x plus 2 has to equal 0. One or both of them needs to equal 0. Otherwise, I won't be able to get 0 as an answer. So that brings us on to our first application of that property. You'll notice here that we're in our actual notes where you should be writing along. We're going to actually start using that 0 property to find solutions of a factored equation. Let me go ahead and pause one sec. We'll swap over to the other camera and we'll do some whiteboard work. So now you'll notice looking here that it gives us the problem. It tells us that 4t plus 1 times the quantity t minus 2 equals 0. Well, I know that one of those two has to equal 0. Otherwise, I won't get 0 as an answer. So either 4t plus 1 or t minus 2 needs to equal 0. So I lovingly call this a split. We know that one of them has to equal 0. So we can say that either 4t plus 1 equals 0, or try just to get rid of that glare a little bit. We might just have to live with it, guys. Yep, we're just going to have to live with it. If you pay attention and listen, if you can't see, it should be able to work out. Try to fix it for the next time. 4t plus 1 equals 0, or t minus 2 equals 0. One of those two has to equal 0, or else we won't get 0 as an answer. So to do that, I'm going to solve simply for t. So brother and sister rule, to get t by itself, I'm going to use my opposites. So I'm going to add 2, and I have to do that to both sides of the equation. I'm left here with t equals 2, which is one possible answer. The other one over here, I'm going to again isolate that t. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract the 1 from both sides. That's what I call the brother and sister rule. Whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other. And I'm left then with 4t equals negative 1. And now I need to get t by itself, so I'm going to use my inverse properties again. And divide both sides by 4. So we're left with t equals negative 1/4. So my two possible solutions on this equation to make it true so that one of those two are equal to 0 is either t is equal to 1/4 or t is equal to 2. It could be either of those two, or it could also be both of them. Okay guys, so we know on that last problem that we just worked on, we started with this nice, clean, easy factored equation that said 4t plus 1 times the quantity of t minus 2 equals 0. The reality is that most of the time we don't start with such a nice, clean, easy equation. We actually start with the unfactored version of that equation. We have to factor it ourselves. For the one that we did in the last problem, it would have been 4t squared minus 7t minus 2 equals 0. And then we would have factored that down to get our two multiplying factors there. So I'm going to do a quick review on how to factor. This is something that you learned earlier in the year. So if you don't remember it, this is your quick review. If you remember it well, then just sit back and relish in how smart you are. So I'm going to start with a really simple problem here. You can see that I just have used that same one on the board, which is x squared plus 7x equals 12. And remember, I want to take this and I want to factor it down into two parts. And there's about a million ways to do this. I always tease that there's one way that I would do it, one way that Miss P would do it, and one way that Miss Carol would do it. So in all of those, what we need to do is figure out which number we can put here in the front, so that when we FOIL, remember that FOIL acronym that you used before, so that when we go first times first, we're going to get x squared. So the easy answer on that is there's only two things you can multiply to get x squared, and that's x times x. And then we need to match our lasts. So the last number when we multiply, what could we multiply to get 12? And so thinking about that, my options are I could multiply 1 and 12. I could also multiply 2 and 6. And lastly, I could also multiply 3 and 4. And in doing that, we need to choose the right pair. Sorry about that pause, guys. I have to tell you, Jay, our custodian, just came in to yell at me for still being at school so late at night. So let's go back to our FOILing. To get our lasts to multiply to this 12, I've got some option pairs here. To choose between them, I need to figure out which of these two pairs will add when I do my outers and my inners to 7x. And so as you're looking down at those, we can see that if I added 1 and 12, I would get 13. That's not 7x. If I added 2 and 6, I would get 8. Again, not 13. But if I add 3 and 4, that's going to give me 7. So I know then that these are my two pairs. Or excuse me, my two numbers, my pair. Since everything is positive, my two factors there are x plus 3 and x plus 4. Just to kind of double check to make sure we're all right on it, I usually like to go back and just multiply it out to make sure that that is indeed the right answer. So I'm going to kind of put my double check here in green. So FOIL, firsts, outers, inners, lasts. First times first is going to give me x squared. My outers will be x times 4, which will be a plus 4x. My inners are my two inside, so 3x. And then my lasts are 3 times 4, which is 12. Now I can combine my like terms right there, and that'll give me x squared plus 7x plus 12 equals 0, which gives me exactly the equation I started with, so I know that my factored form is good. So I can move forward with this equation set up to be able to solve for those zeros. Okay, this next one's going to go a little bit more quickly. We're going to go in and find the solutions using our zero property. So we're going to start with that quadratic equation that we're given, which is x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 0. And the first thing that I need to do in this format is I need to go in and factor that equation, because until I have something that is a factored multiplied product, my zero property doesn't do me any good. So in order to do that, I'm going to use that same process as before and figure out what options I could use. To get x squared here at the beginning, there's only only one option, x times x. But now to get 15 here, remember it's that FOIL acronym. So to get my lasts to 15, I have some options. I could use 1 and 15. I could also use 3 and 5. Now you and I both know that we need this to add to 8, and the only of those that will add to 8 are 3 and 5. So my factored form of that equation is x plus 3 times the quantity x plus 5 equals 0. Now I can go in and use my zero property properly, and I know that if these two are multiplied and they give me 0 as an answer, then one of the two or both have to be 0. So I can make a nice split, tell myself that's not an x. Okay, x plus 3 equals 0, and x plus 5 equals 0. So I can solve each of these separately. I need to subtract 3 from both sides, so I get x equals -3, and subtract 5 on both sides there, x equals -5. So my zeros, or my solutions on this parabola, if you think about it, on that coordinate plane, one of them is crossing at -3, and the other is crossing at -5. So my two zeros for my parabola are going to be right there. Okay guys, last problem here. This one's considerably more difficult in the factoring. So we've got 4x squared minus 21x minus 18 equals 0. Remember, our goal is to be able to use that zero property, which means that we need this to be as a factored form. But there's a couple things getting in our way. I hope that you would notice first off the negatives that are in this equation. So I've got a negative here, a negative there. And then also notice that my x squared has a coefficient of 4 on the front of it, which means that I need a coefficient in front of the x's. And I also need a regular factor here on the side. Now, one of the things that math teachers used to always tell me, but I never always kept up with, since one of these is negative and the second one is negative, the only way that I can multiply two numbers and get a negative number is for one of them to be positive and one to be negative. So I know already that I need one positive and one negative. So let's look at some options. If I'm looking for my 4 in the front, I could use, I'll go ahead and mark that as red. I could use 4 and 1. I could use 2 and 2. To get 18 on the back, I could use 1 and 18. I could use 6 and 3. And I could also use 2 and 9. Remember, any combination of those is going to work out. So I could choose, gosh, it's such a bummer with that thing. Okay, it's a little bit easier on you. I could use 4 and 1 and 1 and 18. I could use 4 and 1 and 6 and 3. Could use 2 and 2 and 2 and 9. In this combination, I need to come up with something that is going to subtract to give me 21, multiply to give me 18. So as I'm searching through, trying to figure out what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a stab at the dark and kind of go for the most simple. So I'm going to go with a 4x. So I'm going to choose my 4 and my 1. So I'm going to put the 1 in front of the x. And then I'm going to go with a 6 and a 3. And then I know one has to be positive, one has to be negative. This is going to multiply and give me 6. This is going to multiply and give me 12. Even when I add those together, I'm not going to get 21. So I'm going to choose a different group here. I'll go for a bigger number. I'll try a 2 and a 9. So my inners now are going to multiply to 2. My outers are going to multiply to 32. So when I add those two together, again, I'm not going to get the 2 and 9 that I want. So I'm going to go back to the 6 and 3. Before I put the 6 here and the 3 there, I'm going to try to swap those around. Put a 3 here and a 6 there. Now when I multiply my firsts, I'm going to have 4, which is going to be good. My inners are going to be 3x. My outers are going to be 24x. Well, if I take 24x and subtract 3x, I'm going to get 21. So I know now that I can get 21 in the middle. So I'm going to quickly go through on my double check just to make sure that I'm right. So 4x times 1x is going to be 4x squared. My inners, or my outers, are going to be negative 24x. My inners are going to be 3x. My outers are going to be negative 18. And remember, all of this still equals 0. So I'm going to check my middle here. This is going to add together to be negative 21x. So I'll have 4x squared minus 21x minus 18 equals 0. So I'm in exactly the right spot. I know that my equation is good. So now comes the easy part. After I go back through, I'm going to kind of rewrite up here my factored form so I have a little bit extra space. You guys can do the same thing. So my factored version that we solved for is going to be 4x plus 3 times the quantity x minus 6 equals 0. Now this is where I can use that beautiful 0 property rule. And I know that if those two multiply together to be 0, then one of the two of them, or both, have to be 0. So I'm going to split it. I'm going to have 4x plus 3 equals 0, and or x minus 6 equals 0. So on here, I'm going to go through, since we're finding our zeros, subtract 3 from both sides. I'll have 4x equals negative 3. I'm going to divide by my 4 to solve that equation. I'm going to get x equals negative 3/4. Don't worry about the fraction. It's a perfectly good answer. Here, to get the x by itself, I'm going to go x. I'm going to add 6 to both sides, so I'll get x equals 6. And that's my second point. So remember, when I'm looking at my graph of my parabola, 1, 0 is going to be 3, 4, 5, 6, here at 6. And the other 0 is going to be here at negative 3/4. And then the parabola is going to sit somewhere in between there. Okay, you guys suffered through a long problem there. There's your math joke of the day. Then you can go in and work on the problems in your book or the problems on the worksheet.